Well, you know I'm John Singletary. I'm not an expert on aging, but I am aging, and I think I'm doing an okay job at it. It's definitely better than the alternative. I love this classic picture of women from the 50s reading an iPad. Did you catch that? Here's a picture. It's one of the many family photos I'll be sharing today. This is a story of my uncle looking down at my mom on a tire swing. Stories help us tell, pictures help us tell the stories of our lives and help us communicate across the generations. Here's my mother again with my wife and me. My mom passed away last year. My parents are baby boomers, born between 1945 and 1965. My wife and I are Gen X, born between 1965 and 80. Our children will be mostly millennials or post-millennials. Here they are, goofy as the millennials and post-millennials are, with my wife's father. He's a traditionalist, the generation older than the baby boomers, born between 25 and 45. Even he can make a goofy face in this picture. My grandfather is also a traditionalist, or a member of the greatest generation. Loyalty is what they value most. They value dedication and discipline, duty and family, hard work, patriotism, civic duty, responsibility. My parents here, baby boomers, with our twins 10 years ago, boomers are optimists. Their generation believes anything is possible. They want to make a difference, but they're also a little bit more me-oriented than the traditionalists. Spend now, worry later. Career matters a little bit more to this generation rather than just work. And here we Gen Xers are. Gen Xers are a little more skeptical about life. We value flexibility and fun and education. We have high expectations about jobs, more than just a career, but we also want a little bit more balance in our life. My oldest son is a millennial. Millennials were born between 80 and 2000. He was born in the year 2000. They're achievement-oriented. They value diversity and fun even more than the Gen X parents. They're change-oriented. They value a global community and technology. In terms of families, here's ours. The boomers began to shift away from that Cleaver television family where mom stayed home. They have the highest divorce rate in history. The children of the boomers, the Gen Xers, were latchkey kids. Many more women worked outside the home. We were the first daycare generation. Traditionalists raised the boomers. The traditionalists were raised by parents who survived the Great Depression. The traditionalists faced hard times as children, followed by prosperity. They're great teachers and mentors. My dad, a boomer here, working hard. The boomers were shaped by civil rights and the Vietnam War. They grew up to be the radicals of the 70s and the yuppies of the 80s. The American dream was promised to them as children, and they pursued it. They're a little more materialistic than the traditionalists, but they've worked hard for what they've earned. Gen X, most of my siblings and cousins here in this picture, grew up having to take care of ourselves because we were raised in dual income families for the most part. We also watched our parents get laid off and a big shift of corporate downsizing in the 80s and 90s. We will not do as well typically as our parents financially. Millennials grew up with school shootings, AIDS, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. However, they grew up being more sheltered by their parents. They were kept busy as kids with non-stop schedules. As young adults, they want to be highly engaged. Generation Z with Snapchat, even more technology focused, better multitaskers. Work and play go hand in hand. They're even more globally aware and technologically savvy. They never had dial-up internet and don't know what a home phone is. So how do church leaders engage the technology and the savviness of Gen X, Millennials, and Generation Z? How do we use the technology not like they do, but in other ways? Because communication is non-stop. Here are my kids FaceTiming each other. This constant contact builds relationships, which is meaningful. Music speaks across the generations. I love the music of my parents' generation, and my children listen to the 80s music I grew up with. How can we connect in the church based on the music of the generations? And not just church music, there's plenty of sacred in the secular as well. Here's my daughter on stage on the far left, on my left. A fifth grade class, her play wrote and put on stage about the Little Rock Nine. She interviewed my dad who lives in Little Rock. Why don't we use more drama to tell these stories in the church as well? It reflects the intergenerational realities of our life. The baptism of our boys was an intergenerational affair. We used it as a way to talk about how our faith has shaped us across generations in our family. The Bible tells us this, and the generations can tell those stories in meaningful ways. Here's my spicy daughter, a lot like her mother. There are as many similarities as there are differences across the generations. We emphasize the differences because we can learn from them. We need to honor them, but we have many stories to share in common as well. And my wife says this picture of our oldest son looks just like me. He and I struggle to find things in common in his teenage years. That's not unusual, but it shouldn't be the story of the church. We have many stories to help us find commonalities, many pictures to share, many stories to tell across the generations. And I look forward to learning with you about what that can mean for us. 6 minutes, 45 seconds. So how many of you know, I'll ask the first question. How many of you know who Ariana Grande is? All right, that's pretty good. How about Bella Thorne? Molly Ringwald? Yeah, a few more. Carol Burnett? Yeah. Lucille Ball? The redheads across the generations. I first started thinking about this because that's how I was introduced to how we think about the generations. Is we were talking about social programs. We were talking about adult housing. That we build housing, we build senior adult homes for the Lucille Ball generation, but the Carol Burnett generation doesn't want to live in that retirement home. Well, the same is true for our churches. We don't want, some generations don't want the ministry of a Lucille Ball. They want a ministry of Ariana Grande. But that sounds crazy. But it also sounded crazy to think of a ministry for Carol Burnett 20 years ago. But now, that's the baby boomers. That's who's running everything. So, generations do change, and we have to think about these cultural characteristics as well. So I'd like to hear from you. What are some of the thoughts you had at your time? Well, it's interesting how people define work ethic. So there is a work ethic, but it might be work ethics across the generations. Because there are some differences. But every generation values something about their work ethic. The traditionalists worked for the sake of work. They were committed to a job for the sake of, they didn't mind working for the man. They didn't mind working for the corporation. For the baby boomers, it was more about a career. It was a little bit more me-oriented. But the value of that, it sounded selfish to the greatest generation. But really, it was the opening a door for what we now think about as calling and vocation. That has a much more individualized kind of connotation. It's not working for the church, it's working for individual churches. So even across generations, there's a commonality to the ethic, but there's also even some differences in how we understand what we value about work, and what we value about calling and ministry. But that's a great conversation. And actually, one of the websites I used is completely dedicated to views of work. And a lot of it is about work ethic across the generations. And there was a chart that compared work ethic across the generations. That's it. Oh man, I wish I had better examples of that. That's a lot of what our table talked about. That's most of how we spent our conversation was generational similarities and differences just among staff members. If you're Gen Xer at a staff, are there others on staff who maybe are the baby boomers or the traditionalists? Because that's maybe who the majority of our members are. So how do you relate? And Gen Xers might be more willing to do that than millennials. How do millennials relate across the generations? And it's hard. It is hard for staff, and then that makes it even more difficult for the rest of the church. So I would certainly say, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I would certainly suggest staff having those conversations, and staff and lay leaders, if you're in a small church, having those conversations. Because the rest of the church wants to talk. The rest of the church is already thinking. I mean, we know that it's true in terms of worship, the differences, but it's true in a variety of ways. How we do education in the church and how we serve in the church are all embedded in these kinds of differences. So if the staff and the leaders will talk first, that will pave the way, I think, even if there's not a model church out there. Well, others might have model churches, I just can't think. Matt, would you share the story of different weeks having different styles? I think that was pretty...
Yeah, so one of the things I remember from seminary, which I don't remember everything, but some things I remember, was Dr. York talking in worship class about how over the weeks, worship should reflect the generations in your church. So you should sing Jesus Loved Me some weeks, and then going back to the generations even that preceded us, singing Wesley and others. And our church, one of the things we tried to commit to that, which is, it's hard, I mean, it's work, was we had cards where you could request any song and we would sing it within a month, but you had to attach a story to it. So either we would read it or you got up and shared. And we meant it. I mean, if a 9-year-old requested a song that was just painful, we were going to sing it. And it was interesting to see some of our younger generations loved it. And it helped them put up with music they maybe wouldn't have chosen. The most inflexible was really our older generation, that they just didn't want to do it. but where we succeeded, that was it, where we attached the songs to stories. And it wasn't just so-and-so that likes that music I just don't like. No, they went to an Easter gathering at my grandmother had gone to an Easter gathering at Alta Frio Baptist Encampment, and their song when she was a kid in the 40s, and their song she remembers from that, we still sing at our home because of that. So that was powerful for our church.
One of the things that I think is powerful that I mentioned is the value of stories. When it comes to worship, I think stories shaping worship is more important than style and preference of styles shaping worship. And I think we've divided ourselves because we divide into different styles of worship. But to unite around stories of worship is what Matt's talking about. I love the idea of inviting people to share a story of why that song matters, or that choice of an element of worship being included matters. One of the things that I think also can unite around worship that goes beyond just styles of music across the generations is the use of testimony. Testimonies are kind of a lost art in a lot of our churches. And I've been in a couple of churches where I've seen them use testimony as an exciting way to be able to share a personal story from a different parishioner each week that connects to the sermon and some other element in the worship service. Here's the scripture, here's the title of the sermon. I think Mr. and Mrs. Smith should tell a story of their particular struggle of parenting as a way to help illustrate this, rather than the pastor being the sole storyteller. Use the testimonies of your parishioners as a way to share stories and unite across generations. Too often I think we think about the worship wars and the struggles there. And those are real, but we can work beyond them in these creative blending kinds of ways, I think, if we let story guide us rather than worship styles. One of the things that I often wrestle with when I talk about generational differences is how much is a generational difference and how much is just a developmental perspective. How much of this is just common adolescent behavior or young adult behavior that's developmentally appropriate for 20-somethings or teenagers, and how much of it really reflects a generation. And giving is one of those things, but you have to teach it regardless of what generation, whether it's millennials or Gen Y. You teach adolescents the value of giving when they're in that self-seeking kind of developmental stage, and they won't forget it. One of the things that's different between the millennials and the Gen Xers, my age. So Gen Xers are, now kind of in our 40s, but the millennials in their 20s are more giving than the Gen Xers. The Gen Xers were skeptical of the optimism of our parents. My parents were so optimistic about church and everything. I was like, I just don't get it. And our generation was a little bit more honest about that. And that wasn't always a good thing. But the millennials now sometimes share that skepticism, but they're also embracing some of the optimism of the boomers. And with that comes a willingness to give and to serve. Millennials are more service-oriented. They're globally minded, but they're much more engaged in missions and service, community projects than we were as Gen Xers. So there is a way to tap into giving in these younger generations. There really is a generational difference. Well, one of the things to remember is that millennials, there's a difference between millennials and Generation Y or the post-millennials. So a lot of the kids today we don't know as much about. And most Baylor students really are kind of they're beginning to be post-millennials. So millennials are now in the workforce. They were born in the 80s and 90s, so they're in the workforce. So millennials are a little older than we typically think of as millennial. We typically think of them as kind of the kids today that were born after the millennium. Generationally, millennials are a little bit older. One of the things about churches that really appeal to millennials and appeal to different age groups is that sociologically, sociologically we talk about social capital. What is the capital we have that unites us? And in church life we talk about it too. But it's easier to create bonding capital with similarities than bridging capital across differences. So any group with similarities can bond together based on those similar experiences. So it's easier to create a church that's united around a generational difference or a similarity, a generational similarity, or a cultural similarity. That's why we have so many racial divides in churches. But that's an important thing because church members bond together around those racial similarities and cultural similarities. So we need to celebrate, just like we celebrate the Black church and the Hispanic church, we also need to celebrate the fact that there are millennials worshiping together and different ages worshiping together. But we have to also encourage this bridging capital. How do we bridge our racial and ethnic bonds, and how do we bridge these generational bonds? So there's beginning to be some conversations about how do we look at the strengths that exist in these millennial churches and maybe find ways to bridge those with churches that maybe appeal more to boomers or traditionalists, which is the majority of churches. These younger churches that are bigger, appealing to a younger group, are few and far between, but they're pretty large in terms of size because people who haven't been to church, Gen Xers kind of started walking away from the church, so then we raised millennials who didn't grow up in the church. So when they go back to church, they want to go to a church where they feel that they have something in common with people. So they look for churches. They didn't grow up with a church. It's not true for my family, but a lot of people my age, if the children didn't grow up going to church with their parents and grandparents, when they decide to go back to church as adults, they're not interested in what their parents and grandparents were interested in. They're interested in what they know other 20-somethings are interested in. So we need to learn from that, but then eventually we'll learn more how to bridge that as well. But that's a great conversation to have.